Has the Labour Party forgotten how to do politics? A government elected with a landslide majority less than 2 years ago now looks timid, hesitant and completely overwhelmed by the insurgent politics of Reform UK. The BBC increasingly treats Reform like a permanent government in waiting. GB News appears free to bulldoze through the old broadcasting rules with barely a challenge. A Labour Party political broadcast gets pulled and the government barely mutters a complaint. Meanwhile, ministers are routinely pushed around by political commentators, broadcasters and social media outrage mobs. Reform figures escape serious scrutiny, from Richard Tice's tax questions to Nigel Farage's multi-million-pound donations, while Labour seem terrified of throwing a punch. And then there's the bigger question of all. Despite mounting evidence that, whatever his strengths, Keir Starmer simply may not be a political operator capable of commanding the modern political battlefield, Labour still refuses to confront the issue. This isn't soft left, it's soft, full stop. Naive, passive, delusional. So, after catastrophic local election results and growing instability in British politics, can Labour rediscover its political instincts before Reform completely reshapes the national conversation? Or are we watching the slow motion collapse of a party that won power but never really learned how to wield it? I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Okay, so a damning introduction to this week's Downtown Den Politics Podcast with me, Frank McKenna, joined as ever by Joe Phillips and Jim Hancock, who appears to have had his mouth lobotomized, but there he is, and he's with us full face as well. We do like your face, James. We wish to see it throughout the programme if we may. I have been absolutely astounded at how poor, not the result in terms of Thursday's elections concluded, with Labour losing over 1,000 seats, almost 1,500 seats in the end. I think that was baked in and we anticipated it. But the timidity in which the Labour Party has walked towards those results and then responded to those results is absolutely driving me mad. I'm sick and tired of seeing Labour politicians, Labour supporters on social media complaining about the unfairness of the mainstream media, and aren't the BBC awful, and isn't it terrible that GB News are allowed to put MPs fronting programmes on, and as I said in my introductory remarks there, just basically flouting all the traditional rules that have gone before in terms of UK broadcasting. Who's in government, guys? Yeah. Who are the government who can actually intervene and start to address this bias within our media? But more importantly, even if we had a more neutral media approach to what's happening in our politics at the moment, where is the vision? What is Labour's plan for the future of this country? And why can Keir Starmer not create a narrative? He's speaking in about half an hour's time, and he's going to talk about us resetting for the 99th time, and he's going to talk about us getting closer to the EU, and he's going to say that we're going to be looking after working people a bit better than we have previously. But overall, this is a party that appears to be bereft of ideas, bereft of leadership, and I have to say, Joe, bereft of bottle.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more, Frank. I mean, it is just devastatingly awful, and I don't really know why Keir Starmer is going to even bother to open his mouth today, because most people aren't going to listen. It's not going to save his premiership. It's not going to save the party. And if we look back, as we have done before, it is the timidity and the lack of ability to govern and to take tough difficult decisions, whether it's welfare reform or whatever it is, that has got them into this mess. And we've said many times, nobody knows about the good stuff that's going on because they're not telling it. Well, you can't keep blaming the media. The media is very biased, and it is the most hostile media that I can ever remember to a sitting prime minister at this early stage in a government. Slightly different when they've been in power for ages and ages, but he hasn't got friends in the media. You're absolutely right about the balance and the neutrality that doesn't exist. But it's up to them to change the rules, to change the story. They've never got their message across. And I think Keir Starmer, sadly, because I think he is a decent bloke, I think he got it wrong from the outset with the free suits and glasses, and it's got steadily worse. And I could put my head in my hands at the weekend at the sight of Harriet Harman and Gordon Brown, both of whom I have the most enormous respect for, who have contributed vastly to Britain's national life. But it just reeks of desperation. Have you got nobody else that you can call on? Are you incapable as Prime Minister and leader of this party of saying what you want to do and how you're going to do it? It's awful.
We'll get on to the Brown and Harman appointments a little later on, if you may. Jim, what did you make of Labour's performance? Not in terms of the results, because, as I say, they were baked in. We knew that they were going to do poorly. And clearly the loss in Wales and Scotland exacerbated the problem alongside those local authority losses across England. But the response of Labour, I think, has been so weak. I just can't understand where the fight, as I say, was the vision. And if we're going to have a change of leadership, I'm sorry, they've got to get on with it. They've just got to get on with it. What are they waiting for? Do they think Keir Starmer's somehow going to have a personality transplant? Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister, is the Keir Starmer who was elected 7 years ago. He's no different to that person then. I think we all expected him to have people around him who would be able to give him that political antennae, give him those political directions in order to create a government that was going to move forward and start to do things that were exciting, dynamic, and would turn the country around, would change, as they said on the front cover of their manifesto just 2 years ago. At the very least, what we expected, Jim, was a sort of steady as she goes, less drama. We've had neither of those things. So what is Labour waiting for?
Well, let me really ignite this podcast and defend the Prime Minister, because you called for stability, and that's what I am advocating this morning. That despite all his inadequacies and that sort of thing, the alternatives are really bad for both, in my opinion, the Labour Party and the country. So I believe the Prime Minister should stay in place. He needs desperately needs an Alistair Campbell. I mean, I'm so desperate it might even be Alistair Campbell, because there is nobody enunciating the message, even if the message
bringing everyone else back.
Well, indeed, if it doesn't exist. He needs better advisors around. I think whatever we think of Morgan McSweeney, he was an advisor, certainly in terms of getting the election done, and there don't seem to be the advisors and the heft in Downing Street to take command of things and take command over the Parliamentary Labour Party for what needs to be done, which I'll come on to. We are haunted by the Tory pantomime. Successive prime ministers thrashing around trying to think, another leader will make all the difference. It didn't. It just made the Tory party look absolutely disastrous. It won't of itself change things, won't change the things that really need to be done, because we all know that what the government needs is economic growth. And as far as I can see, the leadership contest, one of the reasons I think it's interesting you describe it as hesitancy and weakness and passivity over the weekend after this catastrophic defeat. I think it's partly because there is no obvious successor. And in those circumstances, not ideal, I agree, they should stick with Keir Starmer, because all the candidates you can mention, have got issues, with the possible exception of Wes Streeting, although he's not vastly popular with the parliamentary party. There's the King's speech on where I don't know why Starmer's making a speech today, quite honestly. I mean, the great advert for the government showing what it's going to be doing in the middle of this parliament is the King's speech, which is coming up this week. So, there's a risk in Starmer speaking as he is as we conduct this podcast, because if it's another flat performance, then it'll just cause further problems. What he needs to announce, and absolutely in chiming in agreement with your analysis, Frank, is bold measures. Council house building, that's a big program of explicit allowing local authorities the finance to build council houses which are enjoyed by those tenants during their occupancy without the right to buy, and then it returns to the council stock. Social care, make the dramatic decision to take it out of local authority thing and put it on the state, and there will be tax implications for that, but it would transform the increasingly paralysed state of local government, which has got no money to spend on anything. And also I would take an even bolder stand on Europe. So that's my opinion, what needs to happen.
I think that the point you make in terms of there not being any natural successor is a good one and a reasonable one to make. And the stability argument is an attractive articulation of what Keir Starmer would be saying to his supporters and to those who are doubting that he can go on. The problem is, Jim, I think he's damaged beyond comeback now, because the talk isn't of Keir Starmer fighting the next election amongst the Labour Party, its members and its parliamentarians. The talk is amongst people who support Wes Streeting, how quickly can we get somebody else to wield the knife in order to enable Wes to put himself forward for the leadership? From the supporters of Andy Burnham, how long can we allow Keir to stay in there in order for Andy to get himself a seat? And for supporters of Angela Rayner, I guess it might be, how long is it going to take her to sort her tax affairs out before she can mount a serious challenge against Keir Starmer? So I think what we've got now is a Prime Minister who's a dead man walking. And I think that the points that you make are all reasonable, but I think that a change of leadership is now inevitable. And therefore, my belief is they need to get on with it. Because the more that they stick with Starmer, they maintain this inability to map out a vision, to do politics in an instinctive, effective way, the more damage the Labour Party brand itself begins to take a hit to. So for me, I understand and appreciate everything you've said. And I think even a month ago, I would have been in agreement with you. But I think the performance of the leadership of the party, both from he and his cabinet colleagues, has been so weak during the past month that my patience, I'm afraid, has failed.
Just a narrow point. Can I just make a narrow point? I mean, get on with it as quickly as possible. I mean, obviously that is the anti-Burnham. I mean, I'm saying you hold this view, but that does exclude Andy Burnham. You would acknowledge that. That's the other little internal problem that is going on at the moment.
Absolutely. I tell you the problem that we've got with Andy Burnham, who is, without question, Labour's most popular retail politician. All the polls tell you that. Using Joe's phrase, he speaks human, he's charismatic, he's authentic, he connects with the voters. But I think there's several problems. I listened to Angela Rayner's speech yesterday, and I thought that it was almost bordering on arrogance, Jim, in terms of what Angela Rayner was saying, because what Angela Rayner spoke about in her speech yesterday was not what was the best interest of what was in the best interest for the country. It was what was in the interests of the Labour Party. So let's bring Andy Burnham back. We've got to allow him to come back via a by-election. So let's just see what that looks like. Well, that means that Andy stands down as Mayor of Greater Manchester, creating a by-election for that very important job. It means an MP resigning their seat for no good reason other than to give their seat to Andy Burnham. Doesn't seem to me to be a reasonable argument as to why you will do that. And again, create additional costs for another by-election.
And there's no
and
guarantee
then let's
he'd
just
win
see.
it.
Well,
let's
Joe's
just
got
see.
the point there.
Yeah, well, that's I'm going to come to that in a second. But only 3 or 4 months ago, here was a government, all of them, Angela Rayner, all the rest of them, saying that we should cancel elections because of the cost. Now, I know they did a U-turn on that, and we've seen the result on Thursday, but where's the justification of an MP resigning the seat in order for Andy Burnham to come back into Parliament, in order for him to do some sort of deal with Angela, to then become Prime Minister or Deputy Prime Minister? I think that the opposition parties, the media, would have an absolute field day. And I think the other problem with that proposition, and you've just both sort of indicated it, would Andy Burnham win that seat? Where is this safe Labour seat that Andy Burnham is guaranteed to win?
Well,
so
and would Labour win
that,
Manchester?
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. It won't be Manchester. I'm told he's looking for a seat
No,
elsewhere.
I mean, but
the
I mean the
mayoralty of Greater
mayoralty.
Manchester.
Oh, and
You know.
well, we've lost that. That's gone.
Yeah.
Right? There is no way that Labour wins that. So you basically sacrifice your biggest metropolitan city region. You've got Andy Burnham, who may or may not win a seat in a by-election, and you've got an electorate confirming their prejudice that they're all the same. Now, if you are talking about getting your best players on the pitch, which is the phrase that I keep hearing from Lucy Powell, from Angela Rayner and others, then take the option that I've been talking about for over 12 months now and give Andy Burnham a place around the cabinet table to drive that important devolution agenda, put him in the Lords. Now, you may say, Jim, he's not going to take that. What is Andy Burnham interested in? What is Angela Rayner interested in? What is Keir Starmer? Are they interested in forming a government that can make progress, make the change that they all say they want, and make sure that the populists are not elected to government in 2029, or are they more interested in personal ambition?
Well, I think you put your finger on it, Frank, and I think the problem is that what we're seeing now is a Labour Party that, even if you took Keir Starmer out, even if you had Andy Burnham as leader through some magical process, you have still got the MPs, many of whom do a really good job, but an awful lot of them are so inexperienced, are so naive, are so wishy-washy about everything, and so timid, whether it's about Europe or welfare reform or triple lock or whatever it is, that it wouldn't make any difference. You've got actually not the best players on the pitch, you haven't got the best players on the bench.
And again, go back to your earlier point, Jim. He needs better advisors around him. How many is he going to have?
Well,
I mean, how many is he sacked? How many have gone in, looked at the chaos at number 10 and resigned? Where are these magic advisors? And let's move on to the Alistair Campbell option. And as I said, well, he may as well, because he's brought Harriet Harman and Gordon Brown back into the field. What did you make of that?
Well, I like, and I'm a big admirer of Gordon Brown. I mean, you know, let's remember that he, at a critical time in 2008, almost sort of, well, he saved the world. That was a mistake that was made. But I mean, the world banking system was on the brink of collapse, and Gordon coordinated an international effort to save it. And he is a serious man who has not been flattered by the effects of office. I mean, you can make arguments that Tony Blair and then even Keir Starmer with his glasses, have made missteps in terms of personal profiting from their political career. Gordon Brown has been a man of complete integrity. I'm not quite sure what his role is in global affairs. I mean, there is a slight danger that he might start to offer the Chancellor financial advice, and then we're back in the situation that we were in in the Blair Brown era. But I'm not particularly exercised by that. But I mean, if it was done as a real sort of gear changing thing, I don't think that was successful. I think the fact the appointments were made after the local elections was. The timing of it was a bit wrong. But I mean, the main problem I think we've identified for weeks now is a sense of what the government stands for. What is its mission? The ability to bring all these, there are some good things going on. Waiting lists are down, two-child benefit. People are going to benefit from that. The minimum wage, bus, rail fares frozen. But there's no bringing all this together as a message. And as I said, I was at the Prime Ministerial briefing in the lower gallery before Downtown's event the other week, and I was very underwhelmed by the government spokesperson. It does need, I mean, I'm not suppose Campbell would be remotely interested, but, there must be somebody around who can, with humour and with threat to some extent, get hold of the press, which is massively hostile. But, you sort of feel that Alistair would grapple them to the Daily Mail to the ground. I mean, that's what used to go on. And that's what it needs, somebody. You have identified something here, Frank. There's a sort of passivity, almost a complete doom loop going on, and it needs someone to sort of say, to hell with it. We've only got 3 more years, and we may never get back into power again. So we might as well go for it and sort of say to the British people, we are not reform. We are not the sort of chaotic Greens who simultaneously embrace people who would treat women very badly, and on the other hand, believe in trans rights. There's huge contradictions in the Greens. Let's go for it. Let's stand for something. And if we go down in flames, ultimately, it's better than this passivity. So that's what's actually needed. I mean, the other thing we need to discuss, I suppose, is whether, talk about this, new talent and so on, whether a reshuffle is about to happen.
Well, I think the reason he's brought Gordon Brown and Harriet Harman back is because he's too weak to reshuffle. We saw during the last reshaping of the cabinet, Ed Miliband simply refused to go from the job at Energy into a new post, which is what the Prime Minister wants him to do. So I fear that the gimmick of bringing Brown and Harman back is basically to say, well, we are refreshing things by going back to the future with 2 people who, like you, I greatly admire, particularly Gordon Brown, of course, but think their time has passed. And so I wasn't inspired, and nor, by all accounts, were Labour MPs. The other thing I'd say, Jim, just let's pick up on this point to do with the media. And I know that you think I've just got this total bias against the BBC now, but I think with good reason. Question time on Thursday night. Robert Jenrick introduced as a shadow.
Yeah, ridiculous.
Secretary. What are the BBC playing at?
Yeah.
What are the BBC playing at? A shadow Home Secretary.
Chancellor.
In whose books? Because Nigel Farage says he's the shadow Home Secretary. Fiona Bruce, on the flagship BBC programme, decides that she can introduce him as such. BBC commentators over the whole of the weekend berating Labour ministers about the results of the local elections. When those Labour ministers push back and begin to say, well, look at the good things we've done. Oh, nobody's interested in that. Let's talk about Keir Starmer. Now, I think there is a duty from the Labour minister to push back hard against that sort of questioning and to start to challenge the BBC and other mainstream media commentators and say to them, no, pal, you might want to talk about Keir Starmer I want to talk about what I've achieved in my role as health secretary or my role as education secretary. If you don't want me to talk about that, don't have me on your programme. And by the way, before I go, can I just ask you what your view is of Nigel Farage's 5 million donation? Because you don't seem to have pushed him as much.
No.
Oh,
I'm
no,
sorry.
Jim.
There
Oh, no.
has been multiple
Nigel Farage
questioning by
simply
BBC
does the
report.
Trump thing. He waves them away and they move on to the next question.
There's
that
been
never
multiple
happens with a Labour minister, a Tory shadow minister. They are getting away with murder. And how and why Labour have not got a grip of GB News and said to Ofcom, do your job, or we're sacking the lot of you, I am absolutely appalled by the lack of action against GB News.
But Frank, the Ofcom thing, and this is where it is fundamentally flawed, will only respond to complaints. If the people watching GB News are the loyal reform audience, they're not going to complain, which is why the New World had this brilliant campaign and said, you've got to, it's up to all of us.
If I am Lisa Nandy, I promise you, I am calling a press conference week one of the Labour government to say we need to clean up our media.
Yeah.
What is happening at this channel over here that says it's entertainment but is called GB News is absolutely out of order, and we are going to move legislation to ensure that Fox News UK cannot take a hold. And the other thing that they ought to have done, and I thought they were going to do this, I remember there being talk about it, but apparently it's not happened, is second jobs for MPs.
Yeah.
Come on. It's easily solved, this stuff. Don't be trying to bog yourself down in the process argument of, I've got to have complaints. If I'm in government, Joe, I'm getting a grip of the powers that I've got. I'm seizing control of the agenda. And I'm saying to the BBC, we're changing your board because that lot over there, bunch of Brexiteers who are absolutely determined to see reform elected as a government in this country. And I'm saying to GB News, we're not going to allow you to have sitting MPs presenting programmes. I remember being taken off City Talk, a Sunday programme that I used to host, business programme. Once a week, I was taken off because I was told, well, you're back on the council now at West Lancashire, so you can't present a local radio programme. Here we've got Nigel Farage with his own programme, Jim, every week, and Labour not doing anything about it.
I agree with you.
Lee Anderson staying on air throughout the local election campaign.
Absolutely scandalous.
Absolutely agree with you on the GB News issue. Absolutely agree with you that he should not have been termed a shadow minister. That was a serious slack mistake by whoever wrote the caption or whatever. Agree with you that, whenever Labour ministers do try and list the things they're doing, you do get the interviewers sort of, oh, yeah, well, we don't want to hear about that. Agree with you on that. But the BBC have rigorously questioned the £5 million donation to Nigel Farage on every programme that I've watched an awful lot of stuff over the last week or so. The BBC have rigorously interrogated Reform spokesman on that. So I can't have that.
Beth Rigby rigorously.
But they don't.
Nigel Farage. The BBC didn't, Jim. The BBC mentioned it and moved on, right? Yeah. And they've done the same with Tice's tax affairs. Angela Rayner's tax affairs were the main headlines on BBC News and the main headlines on BBC News for days and days and days. Farage's £5 million gift has not been on the headlines of the BBC News website at all. Not been a headline at all. £5 million from a cryptocurrency billionaire who doesn't live in this country. That, to me, as somebody who now looks as though he's potentially going to be our next Prime Minister, that's headline news, Jim. It's not a throwaway question in a half-hour interview with the leader of Reform. It's on the website, it's your headline story, and it's got commentary from, I know it's his mate, but Chris Mason. He's got to start calling his mate Farage out. Laura Kuenssberg, Got to stop flattering these people and doing what she did with Johnson, which is, oh, yeah, he's just the lad down in the pub who you can have a drink with. Isn't he funny? Isn't it great? And then just dismissing Fiona Bruce's mistake of talking about Robert Jenrick as a shadow minister when he's nothing of the sort. This is all the sort of stuff, Jim, that the BBC are failing to do. And I don't know whether it's because it's Gibb who's directing things from the background. I don't know whether it's because the BBC feel as though they've got to compete with X. But whatever it is, the government should be showing a bit more bloody balls and getting a grip of it. And I would say it starts with the BBC and it finishes with GB News. Got to get a grip. Nonetheless, if the performance of the Prime Minister and his cabinet doesn't improve, doesn't much matter what the mainstream media do, one way or the other, because they are heading for serious defeat at the next election. That's why I think, in the absence of the ability for the Prime Minister to change his top team, because, as I say, I think he's too weak, the absence of him to be able to map out a vision of his own, the absence of him to be able to keep any advisors, whether it be civil servants or party appointees around him. He's gone through them like a dose of salt over the past 2 years. They've got to change it. Joe, I'm going to give you the final word on this before we move on to second part of the programme. I'm going to have a drink of water and calm myself down. I'm absolutely livid with the Labour Party at the moment, the BBC as well. Joe, final word to you.
I'm just looking. It's coming through because Keir Starmer is now speaking, and he says Labour will never be forgiven if it gets this wrong. And you just sort of think, but you have got it wrong. And it's all of those things. And I completely agree with you with most of what you say. But here is a perfect example. The Supreme Court ruled on single-sex spaces over a year ago. Bridget Phillipson, who is actually quite articulate and quite good and very presentable and all of that sort of stuff, still has not published the guidance for employers and public spaces and things, because she wants to make sure that it's legally watertight. How much more sodding watertight can it be than a Supreme Court ruling? There is a perfect example of weakness and pathetic, foot dragging and hiding behind this legal thing which is in complete contrast to, let's call Palestine Action a terrorist group, which was clearly bonkers and has done nothing to help the people of Palestine and has made martyrs out of idiotic people who go and stand there and, hold up posters and things. And all of those lost opportunities. And I still think whoever changes at the top of the Labour Party, you're not going to do anything unless you get a rocket up the bums of the MPs and cabinet members to say, just get on with it.
And on that note, we'll take a short break. Rocket up the bums of the MPs. There's a soundbite for you that I never thought I'd hear on this podcast.
Josephine.
When we come back, we'll be talking about the local election campaigns as it impacted on the cities, the towns, the regions around the UK, but also the political parties other than the government. Stick with us. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. I've taken my blood pressure pills and now we're going to talk about things other than the Labour Party and its poor performance at last week's local elections. And we're going to start with a city that is, of course, really important to Downtown and its network, but I think important to the country as well. It's Birmingham, the biggest local authority in the country. I think I'm right in saying it's the biggest local authority in Europe. We know it's had its problems in terms of things such as bin strikes and financial challenges. It's declared bankruptcy a couple of years ago. But nonetheless, in recent times, through the work of the City Council, but also its former Mayor Andy Street and more recently Richard Parker, Birmingham has started to win significant investment. It's been regenerated as a city. There's a new football stadium for Birmingham City Football Club in the planning. And of course, Aston Villa, who are going great guns at the moment in the Premier League, extending their stadium as well. Lots and lots of inward investment and interest. But its council, I think you're going to tell us, Jim, is now a little bit of a mishmash as far as its political representation is concerned.
Yes, well, I'll very briefly run through the figures and you'll immediately see the problem. Reform, there are two awards still to count today, one of them being John Cotton, the Labour leader of Birmingham, who was defeated in the Glebe Farm and Tile Hill wards. They've still got to be counted, which I think the feeling is they're going to go to Reform as well. But anyway, the current state of play, Reform 22, Greens 19, Labour 17, Conservatives 16, Independents, Gazans and other people like that, 13, and Liberal Democrats, 12. You couldn't construct a more complex situation, and 51 councillors are needed to control the council. And I've done various formations, I mean, you know, political parties, and it's a fascinating issue because it's going to crop up in the Northwest and other places, a lot of overall control and people who don't like each other having to make local government work. It's going to be a serious problem. I mean, if the Greens, Liberal Democrats and Labour were prepared to work together, you get fairly close to it with 48. Reform and the Conservatives working together, that's a wider issue which we'll want to discuss about the uniting of the right. Rees-Mogg keeps on talking about this on GB News, if I dare resurrect that issue once again. That comes to 38. The Greens and the Independents, 32, well short. It's a real problem, and you've already alluded to the city's problems. In a sense, luckily, they've got commissioners in there at the moment running things. If the political parties show no imagination and no interest in actually working together for the interests of the people of Birmingham, then I think the commissioners will have an even greater role going forward. But it raises a slightly wider point, which I think relates also to the Liverpool City region. You know, this whole devolution thing that's been rolling along largely with, shall we say, Labour driving it in West Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, Liverpool City region and West Midlands, with consent from Conservatives, generally speaking, that it's a good idea, and Liberal Democrats. You've now got in St Helens in the Liverpool City region a Reform Council. Are they going to try and disrupt the devolution on Merseyside? What on earth's going to happen in the West Midlands? So there are wider issues, but it is a serious matter now.
I think there is a question mark over what happens with the devolution debate, because my guess is that Nigel Farage is not a big fan. I'm not absolutely sure of their position on devolution, but I'd be surprised, as I say, if he was in favour, certainly, of giving additional powers to people like Andy Burnham and Steve Rotheram. That's something that perhaps we can get into in future weeks. But let me just stick with this issue that you raised there, Jim, and what coalition has cobbled together. Take it outside of Birmingham, because there's lots and lots of councils across the country in this position now. And I think quite naturally what you've done there is you've said, OK, let's take what we would broadly call the Progressive Alliance and stick them together and say that they could form a coalition party and run Birmingham in this instance. But many other councils across the country will be in the same situation. I would be praying, if I was Nigel Farage, to that to happen, particularly Labour coalescing around the Greens, because the more I look at the candidates and the rhetoric of Green councillors, the more I start to see a very mean-spirited, dare I say, anti-Semitic streak within that party. And I think that whether by mistake or design, what Zach Balansky has managed to do over the past 6 months or so is attract an awful lot of those former Corbynistas who've been thrown out of the Labour Party because of its anti-Semitism. So we've got an issue there for Labour, because if we start getting into bed with the Greens, then I think it leaves a huge opening for the Conservatives and Reform to attack Labour and say, look, they haven't changed that much, have they? And then you look at this other issue, which I think is real fertile ground for Reform as well. And it's these independence that you describe as Gazan councillors, Jim. And again, I've been as big a critic as anyone in terms of Netanyahu and his approach to Palestine and the atrocious attacks that he's made in and around the Gaza Strip. However, that does not mean that local authorities across the UK should be subjected to a foreign affairs debate to which they have absolutely no power to do anything anyway. We've talked in the past about the almost impotent position that the UK itself as a country now, as a government, finds itself on these big issues of international affairs. And indeed, we've also said that given the circumstances and the environment in which he's operating, Starmer has done well in that area. But having a bunch of malcontents in Birmingham waving the Palestinian flag and saying that is the issue, then the good people of Birmingham, by and large, will be holding their heads in their hands. But as I say, Joe, gives Reform greater fertile ground to say, look at this, people. You know, we're told that people are intimidated by Union Jacks being put up on lampposts across white working class areas. But we're supposed to allow the Palestinian flag to be waved wherever and whenever it liked. And we're supposed to accept that, and Jewish people are supposed to accept that as well. I honestly think that the rise of the independents and this Gaza issue in local government and UK politics is really dangerous for the progressive parties in this country.
No, I think you're right, Frank. And I think, you know, what we've seen, again, it comes back to the weakness of Labour in not being able to say to its MPs, OK, we all deplore and are horrified by what Israel has done to innocent Palestinian people and the entire civil infrastructure of Gaza, never mind what it's doing in Lebanon at the moment as well. But it doesn't actually help you get the bins collected or the potholes fixed. And, you know, that's about bringing it back to the boring bread and butter stuff. If you get the boring bread and butter stuff done, then people actually will go, yeah, no, they're all right. I mean, we may come on to the Liberal Democrats, but they got a whole load more council seats, and one of the reasons why is because they just get on with the job. They're not exciting. They, you know, they don't get the same headlines. There are many questions about whether they need a different leader and all of that stuff. But actually, if you get into local government and you do what you need to do, given the huge restrictions about what you've got to spend, because you've got to do adult social care, you've got to do special needs education, and there ain't much left. If you do that well, then people go, oh, you know, these guys are all right. And I mean, part of the problem, I think, is that our politics has become so volatile and so polarized, and part of it is because of Trump, part of it is because of Farage, and now Polanski's come onto the scene, and we're learning a lot more about his fake CV every day that goes past, which you remember the fuss about, you know, Rachel from accounts. But is Polanski under the same scrutiny? And where do those, I heard the West Midlands BBC political editor this morning, and she was talking about Birmingham, and she said even the 19 Greens that have just been elected don't agree amongst themselves, because you've got what she called, you know, the old-fashioned Greens who cared about the environment and recycling and stuff like that, and the others who are actually more engaged in Gaza and trans issues than actually whether the bins are being collected and stuff's being recycled properly.
So it does make this cobbling together of coalitions in other places very difficult, I think, Jim. And you're right to point out the fact that you've got commissioners in Birmingham and a very, very good managing director in Joanne Roney, who I hope decides to stick around. But other local authorities, of course, won't have that comfort. And so there could be an awful lot of chaos across the country, which I hear what you say, Joe, in terms of people looking at councils and saying, well, they're doing a good job, they're emptying me. Sadly, when it comes to elections, local council elections, and again, this was proved on Thursday, local government is treated as the place where you go and cast your vote to give the politicians in Westminster a kicking. And
but that's part of the media coverage. We've lost the local reporters, we've got lost the local government reporters, and so it becomes about the personalities in Westminster instead of.
Yeah, it was all about Starmer. Reform put a wraparound in the local newspapers on Thursday morning, I think it was, and again, where did they get the money to do that? And is it within the spending limits? I know a little bit about spending limit controversies, as you will remember, Jim, in terms of elections. And but, the wraparound said, basically, get rid of Starmer. Nothing to do with local government or local politics. And this all the political parties have to take some responsibility for this, because none of them have taken local government seriously enough over the years. I know we've seen an improvement in recent times with devolution and so on, but by and large, local government is still very much the Cinderella of politics in this country, and that does need to change. But let's just go through the political parties then, Jim. It was obviously a good night for reform, and they made the gains that they were expected to make. We've said previously that this could potentially cause them a problem, because once you start to run stuff and people scrutinise, then that could bite you on the arse. But the big picture here is the Rees-Mogg analysis and his remedy for this split, and it's unite the right. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that, obviously there's been a lot of focus on Labour's catastrophic results, but, in the old way in which we did politics, the Conservative Party in these circumstances would have had a wonderful night at Labour's expense, surging back in local government. That's normally the way that it happens. And it must be of some concern to Kemi Badenoch that they lost another 350 seats and more local authorities. So that after their catastrophic 2024 general election result, they're still, in terms of actual people voting for them, going backwards even further. I mean, everyone acknowledges that Kemi Badenoch is getting more sure in her role and all that sort of thing, but on the ground where it matters, they're going further back. And I suppose that, and you've seen the commentators like Rees-Mogg over the weekend saying, the idea that the Conservative Party is going to regain the position over reform, that it's going to be a credible government of this country in 29 is for the birds. And therefore, they argue, there's got to be some accommodation on the right. But, I mean, personal antagonisms don't count for everything, but there was a very remarkable spat between Victoria Atkins and Robert Jenrick, and she was a real friend of mine, she said, and he's not spoken to me since he left, so there is this visceral concern. And the other person I heard, the Conservatives took back Swindon Council, and the leader of Swindon Council said, I'm not going to, but no overall control, but he said, I'm not going to do reform. They want to destroy my party. So bringing this together is going to be quite difficult. The last thing I would say is that our distinguished friends, Andy Street and Ruth Davidson, who, as you know, I believe should be working in the Liberal Democrats, won't be very amused if there's any talk of that, because they want to restore the Conservative Party as a centre-right party, one nation Conservatives, probably pro-Europe. And if there's going to be a coalition of the right, that is going to, I'd be very interested to hear what Andy Street, I think you have talked to him about this, what they would think about that, because they're going to lose a whole lot of people who will have nothing to do with a coalition of the right, going in with people like Farage.
I think you've just stolen my thunder there, James.
Sorry.
I think you've in a nutshell, identified the big issue for the Conservatives in terms of that unite the right proposition from Rees-Mogg. You would have a whole swathe of not simply Conservative members such as Andy Street, Ruth Davidson, and many others that you can think of. Indeed, your good friend James, aka Tom Cleverly, Mel Stride. I don't think they would be particularly pleased with accommodating reform. And I think beyond that, when you look at the results in the round, and this has been missed because of the catastrophic night the government had, but Reform's vote is 8% to 8 to 10% down from where it was 12 months ago in local elections. And so the trajectory of travel actually, okay, in seats, it looks as though they've had a great night. But in terms of share of the vote, it is clear that Reform have, at least for now, plateaued and are starting to see their support shrink. So I think this is exactly the wrong time for the Conservative Party to start to talk about coalitions. And then you use the word restore in a different context here. But of course, Rupert Lowe now has a political party that won seats in Great Yarmouth. And for all those Reform supporters who we would consider to be Conservative with a small c, I'll tell you what they ain't, Joe. They ain't Conservative with a big C. They are working class voters in red wall seats who actually think Reform is a left of centre party.
Yeah.
Populist, but not right wing. Anti-establishment, anti-Tory. So if there is even a whiff of a coalition of Reform and Conservatives, I would suggest that both parties actually hemorrhage some support there, in much the same way Labour has a dilemma in terms of its relationship with the Greens. I think that Conservatives and Reform have to think really carefully before entering a formal coalition, which, again, I would suggest will fall apart within days of government.
Well, yes, and Reform's front bench, looks an awful lot like the previous Tory government. So why, if you've rejected them once time round, I mean, already within hours of being elected, Reform have had to suspend one of their councillors for appalling racist comments. And I think, I mean, this may be wishful thinking, but I do think as they are in power in greater numbers and greater areas, we will see how competent they are. And, they may well be perfectly competent and able to run local authorities. But what you might see is actually they couldn't run a bath. So come the next general election, we might find that not only have they plateaued, that actually they've gone down. Because they don't even have a foreign, they might have Robert Jenrick as a so-called shadow chancellor. They haven't even got a spokesperson on foreign affairs and defence. One of the biggest single issues facing this country, and they haven't got anybody who does that. So, their retail offer, if you like, it's all about immigration, and everything comes back to immigration. And we've talked about that in the past and how we're all responsible to a certain extent of ignoring the real concerns and fears of people outside of the Westminster bubble. But I think, I think it's really important what Jim said as well about the Conservatives. It's appalling that they continue to lose support and lose support to Reform. So I don't think that Kemi Badenoch has got an awful lot to be pleased about other than Keir Starmer's self-inflicted problems. But I mean, the other areas that we should talk about as well are Wales and Scotland.
Well, we can't, Joe, because we haven't got time.
We haven't got time.
But I want to talk about the Liberal Democrats before we close. So let's just close off on the Conservatives and Reform to say that I think that actually, I know, Jim, you said that they'd shed more support, and they had, and they're looking more like a Southeast regional party than a national party at the moment, are the Tories. But they did win back Westminster in London, which is a bit of a flagship council for them. They did well in other places where we suspected they wouldn't do so well. You mentioned Swindon, or one or two other areas as well. Badenoch's performance in the Commons and as a media performer, I think, has improved, and her poll ratings on a personal level have seen a spike in the right direction as well. So I think that in the round, it wasn't a disastrous night for the Conservatives. And certainly what they won't be doing is beating themselves up as to whether they should be heading for another leadership contest. And let's remember where we were only 12 short months ago. The other thing that I think you have to take your hat off to Badenoch over is she was being pressed about changing her front bench team by a number of commentators over the past 48 hours or so. And she was adamant and said, I've chosen this team. They're the right people. They're good people. They're doing a good job. And I'm sticking with them. How refreshing to see a political leader, may not be my politics, but at least she's got the courage of her convictions to say, I've selected this group of people because I think they're talented enough to do the jobs, and I'm sticking with them. I thought that was a great response from her. So I think it was a decent enough night for the Conservatives. I think, obviously, as I say, Reform did well, but underline the polls show that they have not won as much support as they did last year. And the other thing to say, and as I say, we can't get into Wales and Scotland today, but in Scotland, only for the change in the voting system, ironically, Reform wouldn't have won a bloody seat. So they're not a national party either. Let's move very quickly on to the Liberal Democrats, because we criticise the mainstream media for ignoring them, so we don't want to be accused of that here. Jim, you will have noted, I'm sure with interest, that they took back Stockport, an authority that they've had control of in the past, and you have been owning only a few weeks ago the lack of penetration that the Liberal Democrats have been making in the Northwest. Well, that seems to suggest that maybe all not be lost for them here.
No, well, a caveat about that. I mean, it was, I think it was one seat change. It's always been nip and tuck with Labour in recent years. So it was a one seat change, but an important one. And they won Portsmouth as well. But I'd really like Joe to respond to this, because, the big challenge for the Liberal Democrats is that, at a time when voters are looking for an alternative to Labour and the Conservatives, it's the Greens and Reform that have mopped up in the way in which the Lib Dems should have done. So they're pootering along, doing a good job. Sir Ed Davies, an honourable man, but it wasn't a spectacular night for the Lib Dems.
No, it wasn't, and it should have been a lot better. And I think, there's been a poll out this morning or over the weekend about Europe. We're coming up to the 10th anniversary of the referendum, the Brexit referendum on June the 23rd. I think the Lib Dems should be much bolder in resetting the relationship with Europe, and, because nobody expects them to do anything other than that. And they need to be pushing on the three things that they campaigned on successfully during the general election, which is social care and sewage and pollution in our rivers and waterways. They've got three very clear offers, if you like. I think, unfortunately, Ed Davey has made a few missteps, like calling for the King's visit to America to be cancelled was a silly thing to do. Not going to the Trump dinner looked petulant. And I think he's an honourable man, he's a good bloke, and he has rebuilt the Liberal Democrats. I mean, they were absolutely destroyed after the coalition, and now they've got more than 70 MPs and hundreds of councillors. But I think, it needs an injection of a little bit more energy, a little bit more oomph, and a little bit of actually saying to people, we're not just the plodders, we are a credible alternative.
Just, I know you're pressed for time, Frank, but just on the anniversaries, 10th anniversary of the referendum on the EU coming up, and the 100th anniversary, and I don't think it's received anything like the amount of sort of historic programme coverage it should have had. 100 years since this country had a 9-day general strike in support of the miners. And eventually it collapsed, and the Tory government of Stanley Baldwin, I remember reporting all this, of course, triumphed, and Max Hastings, reviewing a book on this yesterday, said it was a cruel victory for the Conservatives, who forced the miners back to work on reduced wages, and the general working class couldn't come to their aid. It was just 9 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, so everyone was fearful, or the Tories were fearful of a Trotskyist revolt here. I just mention it because it was a remarkable moment in British politics. 3 years later, of course, Labour came to office, but I just wanted to mention that because I think it's a fascinating thing, and it's not received any sort of anniversary coverage at all.
No, it is. It's a fascinating period in our political history. Miners have often featured as the central focus in our politics, haven't they? In the 70s, when they brought the Heath government down, or certainly helped to bring Ted Heath's Conservative government down. And then we talk about the cruelty administered towards miners 100 years ago. Well, I just take you back to 1984 and some of the atrocious things that were done to the mining communities across the country by Thatcher's government then. And I know that we all put our politics aside from time to time and say, wasn't she a wonderful woman in terms of having a plan and a vision? But she could be a right, I won't say the word as well. And there's not many mining communities that you can go to, even today, where you can say the T word without getting some verbal volleys back in your direction. So, yeah, you're right to point that out, Jim. 100 years, general strike. I'm not quite sure what that has to do with the Liberal Democrats' performance in the local elections last week. But I gave you two orange people an opportunity to talk about your party, and you've both blown it. For what it's worth, I think, again, given all the noise, given the lack of media attention that they get, and perhaps that does mean that we need to have a change of leadership of some sort, Joe, then Liberal Democrats did okay, actually. And what I would say is that in places like Liverpool City region, where you've got a very active young leader in Carl Cashman, who's going to do a special podcast with me this week, actually, to talk about his plans for the city of Liverpool.
He'll do well because I've media trained him.
That's what it's all. That's what he said, Jim. He said,
Well,
"Oh no,
he said confidentiality, Jim."
Yeah, he actually said, "I'll do well despite Jim training me." But anyway, it was you were nearly there. But no, I think the Liberal Democrats actually did okay, and I think you're a little harsh on our Liberal Democrat friends. And if I were to look ahead sort of 2 years, 2.5 years, to think about the way in which this country appears to be going in terms of its voting intentions and in terms of coalitions, then where I find it difficult to see a Labour Green coalition, I can imagine a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition emerging from the mess that we're in now. But don't write the Conservatives off. They've been written off many, many times before in the history, as Jim will have reported. And it's not happened yet, and I don't expect it to happen next time either. Right, well, it's been a good counselling session for me. I got all my ranting out of the way in the first part of the podcast. Do apologise to people for me going off on one there, but I am furious with a Labour government that we waited to elect for 14 years, totally fucking it up in less than 2. Hopefully they'll get back on track, and next week we'll be talking about Keir Starmer's reset, whether those challenges to his leadership have abated, and of course his King's speech, which happens on Wednesday of this week. Thanks for joining us as always. See you again in 7 days' time.